So, guys, I want to do a video about AJ Styles, and there is a lot of talk of him joining AEW wrestling. And I did a video yesterday talking about 10 reasons why he should join AEW wrestling. And I do want to mention that I'm actually in the favor that, if he wants to retire, number one, it should be WWE doing his retirement. Because, obviously the biggest stage that he can have is WrestleMania. And then the second biggest stage is in AEW. The third biggest stage would actually be New Japan Pro Wrestling. And then the third biggest stage is obviously, a fourth biggest stage is obviously TNA Wrestling. So I want to actually 10 reasons why he should not wrestle in AEW, just to give some insights to have some conversation. My first reason is I don't want him to become another Chris Jericho. Because, what happened with Chris Jericho was when he joined AEW, he had a lot of really great matches. Then over time, he became a glory hog. Over time, he kind of had a lot of really creative ideas. He monopolized the ROH championship. So you kind of never know when somebody's in a company and they have somebody in charge like Tony Khan that allows a wrestler to have a lot of creative freedom. You can run into a situation where AJ Styles becomes the ROH champion for a very long time, or they can say, okay, well, MJF, we're going to cut everything short with you, and we're going to give it to AJ Styles, or we're going to make him a double champion, or we're actually going to make him a triple heavyweight champion by giving him the IWGP championship. You know what I'm trying to say? That sometimes when you have a wrestler, you can run into a Chris Jericho or a Mercedes Moné situation where they're trying to take all the titles, where they think that, oh, well, they're so big and grand, really. And ultimately, too, when you have people like Vince McMahon or in TNA wrestling where Vince Russo had a lot of power and Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff, or when you were in WWE and Triple H has a lot of power now, sometimes it nerfs a person's ego. So one big thing is that because Tony Khan, sometimes when he likes a wrestler, he'll let them kind of be over decorated or have a lot of creative control, really. So we kind of don't want another Chris Jericho situation with AJ Styles. I think another big concern is we don't want him to become another Jon Moxley, and what that means is that with Jon Moxley, he wrestled hardcore matches. He did a bunch of bloody stuff. You can also throw in, you don't want him to become like Darby Allin, where he's in Anarchy in the Arena and doing other things like that. Like with AJ Styles, he's very athletic. And, sorry, guys. Sorry, guys, I've been having a bit of a cold. But with AJ Styles, you don't want him to kind of like turn into like a hardcore blood and guts, fork through the face type of wrestler. Or there might be a motivation for him to kind of, do all that stuff. Or be like, okay, well, I don't think he and Jon Moxley ever wrestled. So you can kind of do like a hardcore match or a blood and guts match, the Phenomenal Ones versus the Death Riders. Or you can actually have him participate in blood and guts or other things like that. So I think that's another big concern is what would happen if he kind of is like, okay, you know what? I want to be in all these bloody hardcore matches. And I think like the third reason is becoming a video game wrestler, because a lot of people have criticized Will Ospreay. Like when he had that match with Kyle Fletcher last year, like the Spanish Fly, and then he did the Tiger Driver to Kyle Fletcher, I think on thumbtacks or glass, and he did that multiple times. Like he can kind of be encouraged to kind of be a little overabundant with his matches, because I think like with WWE, WWE is good in a way because you look at somebody like Penta, and with Penta, he's not doing multiple Canadian destroyers on something like 6 or 7 in a row or exchanging with somebody else, really, because with some people that looks epic and some other people that looks unrealistic. So you don't want him to get into a situation where it's AJ Styles versus Will Ospreay and they're hitting each other with Tiger Drivers and pile drivers, 5 minutes into a match, and then 40 minutes later, they're doing it again, and then maybe at the hour point, you get a pinfall. So you can kind of run to a situation where he might be encouraged to actually, wrestle maybe in a more like video game style. Because, in a video game, you can like Dead or Alive, really, you can drop somebody on their head and then, in the first 5 minutes, and then you still have a health bar and you're doing the other things like that. I think the other thing that I would say is his final opponent would be a concern, because I think no, it's really like the other issue is building a new star. And the problem is that you can run into a situation where with AEW, they struggle with building new stars, because you look at Hobbs, he left the company. Ricky Starks, he left the company. Mariah May, she left the company. And really, you look at someone like Anthony Bowens, who is like, his story is to reunite the Acclaimed, really. So you really don't have a lot of new stars. If you think about new stars, it's really like Bandito, in my opinion. They're trying to do Kevin Knight and Mike Bailey. There's Wheeler Yuta, who's been a failed experiment. There's Kyle Fletcher. There's Konosuke Takeshita, really. But there's really not a lot of new stars, really. So it's ultimately like, what happens when you get into a situation where you bring in AJ Styles and you're kind of like, okay, we're set for the rest of the year because he's going to retire at the end of the year. So we're going to have all these epic dream matches. We're going to do him and Samoa Joe. We're going to do him and Will Ospreay, him and Jon Moxley, him and maybe Konosuke Takeshita, because they can wrestle really good. We're also going to do him and maybe like Jay Lethal. Christopher Daniels could come out of retirement, Hangman Adam Page. Like, the problem is, what about a new star? Are you going to do something like, say, maybe Takeshita or Kyle Fletcher can split off from the Don Callis family, and then one of their proving grounds is that they're going to have a final match, and the final match of the year is going to be, it's going to be a new star versus AJ Styles. More than likely, they won't do that. More than likely, it'll be Okada versus AJ Styles, or Ospreay versus AJ Styles, or MJF versus AJ Styles. So ultimately, who's going to become a new star out of this? Because you're bringing in somebody else from a different company, and you're kind of you're choosing them over new stars, really. And you got to have new stars, because like that's one of the reasons why TNA failed, is because they made it like WCW light, really. As a fifth reason, I would say you could run to a CM Punk incident, because I know like one of the big issues with CM Punk was that he did not like Jack Perry doing a bunch of hardcore violent shit, and he also didn't like Jack Perry doing that because, obviously sometimes what some wrestlers will do is that they'll do a storyline where they get injured, so that way they're taken off television for a couple of weeks so they can go to Hawaii or wherever. It's just a way for them to be written off and then just do minimal amount of work, really. So you run into a situation where maybe AJ Styles talks to Will Ospreay, or he talks to like Jack Perry, or he talks to Speedball Mike Bailey or a few other wrestlers on the roster, and it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe I'll show you or talk to you about how to wrestle a little bit better. You don't always have to do epic stuff after epic stuff. Or you can talk to Kyle Fletcher and be like, okay, you don't need to always receive like pile drivers on your head, really. You can kind of reduce that a little bit to do it safer, but also you don't always need to do this really, really epic shit, really. You can kind of like get a lot. You almost like could do almost sometimes less is more, really. So you could run into a situation where you could have other wrestlers like Kyle Fletcher or the ones be like, you know what, fuck you. Even though you're a veteran, I do whatever the fuck I want, really. So you could run into a situation where you become disgruntled. Like AJ, like CM Punk. And you kind of look at like him and Jeff Hardy when they did that angle where he was yelled at Jeff Hardy in TNA Wrestling for messing up the company, really, because he got drunk, really. So that could be another thing with AJ Styles. So you can kind of be like, you know what, I don't want to be here because everybody does whatever the hell they want, really. Or, I was hired to have dream matches because they don't know how to build new stars or whatever, really. So he can kind of like almost become like CM Punk in a way where it's like, hey, you know what, I'm just mad to be here because it's just too much, really. Another thing that he can do, with another thing about AJ Styles is another big concern is that this is not TNA wrestling, because ultimately didn't he start in TNA wrestling? It doesn't make sense for somebody to not start in their former company. I mean, for example, you look at somebody like Jon Moxley. Maybe he should. When Jon Moxley retires, maybe he can join the Tournament of Death in Combat Zone Wrestling, or maybe Bryan Danielson could do a few matches in Ring of Honor or something like that. Like, sometimes it's good to kind of retire where you started from, like a full circle. And that's not really a good full circle for AJ Styles, really, to retire in AEW. Because it's almost like, he has no story or history with that company outside of that some of his former colleagues wrestled there. So it's not TNA wrestling, really. And I also think that another thing is that this is not WWE, because which is a bigger platform? Wembley Stadium, where they drew I think around 40,000 people last year, or WrestleMania where they usually get like 70 to 80,000, or what about the first WrestleMania in Saudi Arabia? Again, as I said before, and I'll say it again, that's historic. That's 70 or 80,000 people in front of like a show. And maybe their all-in show last year was like 20,000, 22,000. So do you want to be around? Do you want to retire around 22,000 people, or do you want to retire around, like 70 to 80,000 people? This is not WWE, really. So that's like my seventh reason. And I have three other ones. My third reason is that there's way too many factions in AEW. So he can easily join the Young Bucks and Jack Perry again. And then, as we kind of said before and said it again, really, it runs into that situation of why do we need another faction? Or why is it that we always have to do tag teams and multi-person matches? We have a star like AJ Styles. So why is it always that he has to be thrown? Why is it always that people have to be thrown into faction? There's too many factions in AEW. Like last week was one of their best shows because they only had one tag team or multi-person match, really. So if you add AJ Styles, there's an opportunity for him to say, I'm going to be with the Young Bucks. I'm going to feud with the Don Callis family. I'm going to do all this shit, really. And I'm not going to wrestle by myself, really. So he kind of runs into that situation where they're going to say faction, or his final match could be a street fight between the Young Bucks, Jack Perry, and AJ Styles, the four of them versus four members of the Don Callis family. That could be his final match. Ultimately, over group versus group, really. So that's another problem. I think as a ninth reason, one of the biggest problems is that it's a temporary fix. And what that means is that if he retires at the end of this year, one of the big problems is, what does AEW do in 2027, 2028, 2029, 2030, so on, so on, so on. Because, again, you're not building new stars. You're just, what you're doing is that you're taking stars from other companies and you're putting them in here, and you're not building new talent, really. So it's a temporary fix. I mean, obviously you'll have great matches for the rest of the year. You'll have must-see pay-per-views with AJ Styles on it, but it's ultimately what are you doing for the future, really? It's almost like when TNA wrestling didn't build new stars. So they struggled after AJ Styles, Stig, and a lot of people left the company in 2014. And it took a couple of years for them to actually build new stars. You look at the Attitude Era. I think what happened was that during the Hogan era, towards the end of it, they had Shawn Michaels and they had a few other people, but they were still building their star power. But when it was between Attitude Era, it was between the Hogan era and the Attitude Era, they were struggling to build new stars. And a lot of people watched WWE. That was when they were in a downwards turn. So the AJ Styles, that could be the same thing. They could be like, okay, if we focus on AJ Styles, what about Kyle Fletcher? What about Anthony Bowens? What about Ace Austin? What about Bandito? What about Brody King, who's never gotten a shot at a heavyweight title? What about Max Caster, Commander, and a few other people on the roster who are these new stars, who are these young stars who maybe been to TNA for a while, but they never really broke out in TNA. Or what about people AEW side that never really broke out in any other company except AEW, really? So what happens when they're not built, or they're not compelling, or they're not working on becoming better stars, and then AJ Styles retires, really? You kind of run into that situation of, what do you do next, really? And then my final reason is that, there's a high chance for, sorry guys, I have a really big toenail I have a real big fingernail that I want to clip. It's not my middle finger. But one of the big problems also with AEW is that there's a high chance of injury. Because honestly, too, he could wrestle a match with Kyle Fletcher or Will Ospreay, and he could kind of hurt himself by going too long, or hurt himself by being thrown to a barricade, or do a stunt or something like that, and he can get paralyzed for life. He could also be in a situation where if he wants to retire at the end of the year, what happens if he has one or two matches and then there's other matches, and then he can't do it because he gets hurt or whatever. And then people are going to be focused on how AEW wrestles a more dangerous style, really. So that's also another issue with AEW is that, there's a high chance for injury with whoever they bring in, really. So I think, like, for all these reasons are reasons why AJ Styles should not go to AEW. However, I think AEW would be the best option for him.